Part 6 of Chapter 6. The Sufians declare in a various ways that this, the ether, and the ether lights, and we ourselves are like a mirage. If there is only one indivisible, all-comprehensive, absolute, how can there be the comparable and comparison? The divine is without divisibility, and the divine is without indivisibility. The divine is without activity. The divine is without change ability. If there is only one indivisible, all-comprehensive, absolute, how can there be worship? How can there be austerity? The self is verily divine, undivided, all-knowing, and devoid of largeness and smallness. The mind is indeed the indivisible, all-comprehensive, absolute. How can we do anything with the mind and speech? The self is the negation of the distinct between night and day. The self is the negation of the rising and the not rising. If there is only one indivisible, all-comprehensive, absolute, how can there be the sun, moon, and fire? The self is that from which the distinction of desire and desirelessness, of action and inaction are gone. If there is only one indivisible, all-comprehensive, absolute, how can there be consciousness differentiated by the interior and the exterior? If the self is devoid of essence and lack of essence, if self is without void and non-void, if there is only one indivisible, all-comprehensive, absolute, how can there be a first? How can there be a last? If the self is the negation of difference and non-difference, if it is the negation of the knower and the knowable, if there is only one indivisible, all-comprehensive, absolute, how can there be the third? How can there be the fourth? The spoken and the unspoken are not the truth. The known and the unknown are not the truth. If there is only one indivisible, all-comprehensive, absolute, how can there be objects, senses, mind, and intellect? Ether and air are not the truth. Earth and fire are not the truth. If there is only one indivisible, all-comprehensive, absolute, how can there be cloud? How can there be water? If the self is the negation of imagined worlds, if it is the negation of imagined gods, if there is only one indivisible, all-comprehensive, absolute, how can there be discriminating consciousness of good and evil. The self is the negation of death and deathlessness. The self is the negation of action and inaction. If there is only one indivisible, all-comprehensive, absolute, how can one speak of coming and going? No such distinctions exist as spirit and earth. There's no difference between cause and effect. If there's only one indivisible, all-comprehensive, absolute, how can one speak of self and not self? There's no coming of the third kind of misery or the second kind of misery due to the elements. If there's only one indivisible, all-comprehensive, absolute, how can there be an old man, a young woman, and an infant? The supreme is without caste and stage of life, without cause and agent. If there is only one indivisible, all-comprehensive, absolute, how can there be consciousness of the destroyed and the undestroyed? The destroyed and the undestroyed are both false. The born and the unborn are both false. If there is only one indivisible, all-comprehensible, absolute, how can then be the perishable and the imperishable? The self is the annihilation of the masculine and the feminine. The self is the annihilation of the feminine and the non-feminine. If there's only one indivisible, all-comprehensive, absolute, how can there be consciousness of joy and lack of joy? If the supreme is free of delusion and sorrow, free of doubt and grief, if there is only one indivisible, all comprehensive, absolute, how can there be I and mine? The self is the destruction of virtue and vice. The self is the destruction of bondage and freedom from bondage. If there is only one indivisible, all comprehensive, absolute, how can there be here any consciousness of sorrow and the absence of sorrow? No distinction of the sacrificer and sacrifice exists. No distinction of fire and ingredients exists. If there is only one indivisible, all-comprehensive, absolute, how can there be any fruits of work? The self is verily free from sorrow and absence of sorrow. The self is free from pride and the absence of pride. If there is only one indivisible, all-comprehensive absolute, how can there be consciousness of attachment and non-attachment? No such change as illusion and freedom from illusion exists. No such change as greed and freedom from greed exists. There are never any you and I. The discrimination of family and race is false. I am indeed the absolute and the supreme divine truth. In that case, how can I make salutation? The self is that in which the distinction of teacher and disciple disappears, and in which the consideration of instruction also disappears. The self, indeed, is the absolute and the divine truth. In that case, how can I make Salat? There's no imagined divisions of bodies. There's no imagined divisions of worlds. The self indeed is the absolute and the divine truth. The self never endowed with passion or devoid of passion. The self is very spotless. The self is nothing. The self, therefore, is pure. I am indeed the absolute and the divine truth. No distinction such as body and bodiless exists, nor is it true that there is false action. I am indeed the absolute and the divine truth. In that case, how can I make salutation? Where self knows nothing, there is verily no difference. The divine one, pure of thought, absorbed in the consciousness of the divinity, becomes one with the self. Peace and eternal love in K.O.S.